I guess as far as like just general announcements for the museum and the historical society and so on, Arla texted me and asked me to say there'll be a Gaiman chapter meeting on the 14th. What else did you say? Oh, yes. And she said it'll be the Pioneer Day Queen and Parade Marshal and their family history given by Phyllis Stevens. Ooh, okay. At normal time. And I guess with that kind of stuff in front of you now, this is Dr. Mathew Wedel, who is an internationally renowned expert in sauropod dinosaurs. No, but he is, and you're a native Okie too, right, Matt? Did you come from Edmond, right?
I grew up in Hillsdale, little tiny town northwest of Enid.
Okay, all right. So I knew that. I was pretty sure that was also that you were at least a native Oklahoman. And you did your undergrad and your master's at OU, is that correct?
Yep, that's correct.
Okay, all right. And that's how you kind of got familiar with then the Cimarron County stuff, right? The Cimarron Valley dinosaurs.
Absolutely.
Okay. All right. And Matt is going to talk to us about the sauropod dinosaurs that came from out there. Like I said, we had, when we first started this off, we had Dan Jury talk to us about Saurophaganics, and I was looking for things that were unique, things that set the Cimarron County stuff off from other sort of classic Morrison localities, like at Morrison, Colorado, or Como Bluff, Wyoming, or Dinosaur National Monument. What are some things that make sort of the Cimarron County fauna itself unique? And so there's obviously this big enigmatic theropod, meat-eating dinosaur that came from out there. And then the sauropods, which are big attention grabbers, and especially there are basically, and Matt will correct me if it's wrong, basically hatchling sauropods, right? Not to get too far ahead of ourselves, but basically part of that sauropod fauna is some sauropods that just barely hatch, right, Matt? Or
pretty young, yeah, probably yearlings, but definitely very small.
Okay, all right. And so that was immediately the next thing kind of unique about the stuff that had come out of the Black Mesa area that had caught my attention. And like I said, thought that it would be interesting to find someone who would talk about that aspect of what had come out of the Cimarron Valley. I'm in talks also, I guess, as far as our series goes. I mean, I'm trying to get, well, Sue has one idea that we may go with about just some geology stuff for next month. I did reach out to someone about doing someone who's done some work with Antelope Creek phase in the Antelope Creek kind of stuff in the Southern Plains. And I do have May's in the book. So on May 26th, we will be talking with James Blackshear, and he's going to talk about the history of Fort Bascom, which has a lot of connections with our area history, Fort Bascom, New Mexico. And then we'll have to talk amongst ourselves if you guys want to keep doing this over the summer. Sue kind of wants to keep, or I don't know, I shouldn't say her. She mentioned that there are some people who have said that they would like to keep going in the summer. Doesn't matter to me. I just know that a lot of times we don't do Gaiman chapter stuff and so on during the summer. So I hadn't really planned anything for the summer months, or really done anything looking for like June, July, or August. I do have Paul Andrew Hutton at least tentatively on the schedule to do Sheridan's winter campaign in September. Talk about Sheridan's winter campaign of 1868 and 1869 in September. But if people want to keep it up through the summer, it's totally fine with me. We'll keep finding people to talk then. But anyway, we can discuss that at a later date. In the meantime, like I said, this is Dr. Mathew Wedel, and we're going to talk about sauropod dinosaurs. He'll explain what that is to you and everything. So take it away, Matt.
Thank you. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And hopefully you all are seeing my title slide.
Yes.
So thank you for the kind introduction, Seth, and for the invitation. This is a thrill to talk to you all. As an Oklahoman transplanted to California, I don't often get to talk to Oklahomans. It happens once in a while, but not as often as I'd like. So it's a real pleasure to be here. So I'm going to mention the other dinosaurs, but as Seth said, my specialty is sauropods, and you're going to get a lot of sauropods tonight. So buckle up. He's correct. I did my undergrad and my master's work at the University of Oklahoma, then came out to California for my PhD, and now teach here at a med school. And so I'll deal with one of the questions that often comes up, which is, what the heck is a dude who teaches at a med school working on dinosaurs? And the answer is that I am a comparative anatomist by training. So I've gotten to work on all kinds of interesting things, like that emu, there's a hemisected horse head and neck, there's a hyena I got to dissect when I was working on my PhD, a rhino skull that a friend of mine CT'd, half an alligator, pigeon. And so to me, the human anatomy that I teach at the med school is a subset of comparative anatomy. We just throw away the other species, or try not to talk about them too much when we're supposed to be focusing on humans for the future doctors. And there are many roads to paleontology, and people come to it through geology and other ways, but paleontology, the way I practice it, is as a comparative anatomist. I'm interested in how these animals were put together, and frankly, how we can put them back together after nature has taken them apart. So anatomy is really my bag. But this story starts a little over 90 years ago in 1934, when they're putting the first paved road in through the Panhandle, and just about 10 miles from the New Mexico border, they hit bone, a big rib that turned out to be from a giant sauropod. And so that was the first dinosaur quarry in the Panhandle. And here you can see that quarry. So the road is running through here, and it still runs through there, and you can go to that quarry today. So this project came under the auspices of J. Willis Stovall, who was at the University of Oklahoma. He was a geologist, and he was able to get money from the WPA and from other citizen employment projects that were going on during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, to hire farmers and machinists and other folks who are out of work, truck drivers, to dig up and prepare dinosaur bones. So here is one of his crews. The guy here who's looking right up at the camera, that's Juan Langston, who went on to have a fantastically storied career in paleontology himself, and only passed away a few years ago. And I was fortunate enough to meet him and learn from him when I was up and coming as a graduate student. Also, field clothes have come a long way. We don't tend to go to the field very often in long sleeve shirts unless the weather's really cool. And I've definitely never worn a tie in the field or seen anyone who did. Here's a group of folks at what I believe is Stovall's Quarry 5. So once he realized that there were dinosaurs out there, Stovall got teams running around, looking around the whole Black Mesa area for dinosaur bones, and ended up finding about a dozen localities where there was at least something sticking out of the ground. Now, some of those went on to be productive quarries that turned out dozens or hundreds of fossil bones, and some of them were just a single bone or a single partial skeleton, and once that was collected, there was nothing more to find. And his guys were digging these things up, preparing them, putting them in plaster jackets. They were getting shipped back to Norman, where they were getting uncrated and prepared. And he had WPA preparators, volunteer preparators, well, not volunteer, they were hired preparators, but it was all, he was making the best of the situation that he could during the Depression, getting money to hire these guys, but keeping people on and having continuity was a struggle, because he'd often lose people month to month and year to year, exactly who was going to be available, whether they would have a lot of experience, whether they would have been a good leader in the field. That was changing frequently. And the toolkit that they had available was pretty unspecialized compared to what we have today. So today we would like to be preparing fossils with tools like air scribes, which are basically miniature jackhammers on the scale of something that a dentist might use, and using really fine scale things. They were using, their toolkit was basically hammer and chisel, pocket knife, and sandpaper. And one of the rough things at several of the quarries at Black Mesa is that the bone is essentially the same color as the rock matrix. So as they were sanding, in some cases trying to sand off the last bit of the rock, they would be sanding into the bone, and they wouldn't necessarily know that they had until they started seeing the internal spaces in the bone, and they might have sanded the surface bone right off in a few cases. So lots of fossils got collected. The preparation was the best they could do at the time with resources that they had. I don't fault them a bit. We would prefer to do things differently today, but we're all limited by what we know and what resources that we have. And they did amass an incredible collection of fossils that's really valuable. And Stovall published a few papers on these, and the most important was this one from 1938, the Morrison of Oklahoma and its Dinosaurs. And he figured some material. This is not all of the material that he figured, but this is what the illustrations look like, hand-drawn illustrations of these bones. So 1 and 2 are teeth of Camarosaurus, these sort of spoon-shaped teeth of a sauropod dinosaur. Here's several erupting from a jawbone. 3 and 4 are a back vertebra and a thigh bone of what Stovall called Brontosaurus, what then got called Apatosaurus for a long, long time, and now is probably going to be Brontosaurus again. Brontosaurus is back in the sense that after essentially 100 more years of collecting fossils and studying them, we now realize that what we might call apatosaurine dinosaurs fall into 2 groups in terms of their anatomy, and one of them we're now calling Apatosaurus, still calling Apatosaurus, and the other one it makes sense to call Brontosaurus. And I think that the one that we have in the Panhandle is going to be a species of Brontosaurus when the most detailed comparisons are done, which they're not. But he talks about the Morrison of Oklahoma, and as I gather from Seth's introduction, a lot of you already know that the Morrison Formation is a big formation from the late Jurassic period that spans a lot of the American West. And so I'm going to detour and talk a bit about the Morrison. We'll come back to Stovall's finds in a bit. So I work in the Morrison not only in the Oklahoma Panhandle, but also in central Utah. And this is what the Morrison looks like out there. And we've got some sandstone from river channels, and we've got big clay beds from volcanic ash that was covering floodplains, and plants were growing on it and animals were living there. And they're getting buried in flood events or overbank deposits from the river systems. And it looks very different from what it did when it formed. So here's where the dinosaur bearing rocks are in Oklahoma. So down in the southeast corner, there's this green stripe that cuts across that extends into Texas to the south and into Arkansas to the east. Those are early Cretaceous rocks. And they're from about roughly 110 million years ago. We have dinosaurs like Sauropod, Tenontosaurus, Deinonychus, and Acrocanthosaurus. And then right out here at the tip of the Panhandle, near Kenton and Black Mesa, we have exposures of upper Jurassic rocks, the Morrison Formation. And there's others. There's Triassic rocks out there too, and some Cretaceous rocks. But the really productive dinosaur-bearing rocks are from the Morrison Formation. This is about 145 million years old, so considerably older than the stuff from the opposite end of the state. But we have big dinosaurs from there too, including Brontosaurus, Stegosaurus, Camtasaurus, and what I've always called Saurophaganax, but maybe I'm mispronouncing that. I'm going to roll with that for now, and maybe consult with the injury the next time I see him about how I'm supposed to pronounce that critter's name. So the little bit of the Morrison Formation that's exposed in Oklahoma is just the tip of a very large iceberg that goes from central New Mexico all the way up into Canada and from central Utah over to the Great Plains. Now, there's no Morrison rocks exposed in Kansas or Nebraska, the Morrison dips under younger sediments. So east of the Front Range of the Rockies in Colorado, there's not a lot of Morrison to be found. There's the Morrison exposures in Oklahoma. There's some in northeastern New Mexico. There's the Black Hills of South Dakota. Other than that, all of this Morrison out here in the Plains states is deep underground, covered by a lot more recent sediment. Maybe in another 20 or 50 million years, if the Great Plains erodes, there will be fantastic dinosaur bearing mesas and buttes in Nebraska and Kansas, but not right at the moment. So we're interested in the Morrison Formation in Oklahoma because we're on the edge of the basin. So this is a big depositional basin, one of the biggest dinosaur bearing formations in the world in terms of its extent. Now, it's not like every square inch of Colorado has Morrison exposed at the surface, but there is a lot of Morrison exposure out there in all of these states other than the Plains states. So we're on the edge of the basin. We might be picking up different critters, different environments than we're going to find in the Front Range of Colorado or on the Colorado Plateau or up in Wyoming. So the collections from Oklahoma are important. And so, as I mentioned, when we look at the Morrison Formation, we have to try to see through time and imagine not the rocks as they look today, but try to infer the environment in which they were deposited. And it probably looked something like this. This is from Brazil. This is part of the Amazon rainforest, and there's a big river cut here, and we can see that there's a lot of soil here that's built up from many generations of trees and animals living and dying and getting buried. Now, this is a rainforest, it's acidic soil. It's probably not forming a lot of fossils, but where you have a river that's bringing in pulses of sand and clay and mud, then there may be opportunities for things to be buried and preserved as fossils. So the Morrison Formation, when it was being laid down, was probably a lot more similar to this, probably a semi-tropical or subtropical, might have been seasonal. There's definitely evidence for dry spells, but there's also evidence of lush growth and environments that could support a lot of big animals. This is a reconstruction of a Morrison environment by my friend, paleoartist Brian Eng, who was kind enough to let me use his art. And this one was created to represent an environment in Utah, but actually most of these animals, almost all these animals, are represented in the Morrison Formation of Oklahoma. So we've got a couple of Brachiosaurus here in the foreground. We've got a herd of Camtasaurus, sorry. Sort of small proto-duckbill thing about the size of a cow. There's Camarosaurus, another long neck. There's some Apatosaurs or Brontosaurs back there. There's a Diplodocus in the background. There are some Allosaurs taking down a young Diplodocus. There's Stegosaurus. There's some smaller plant-eating dinosaurs. We have all of those things from the Oklahoma Panhandle, and I will show you some of their fossils as we go forward. So those fossils that Stovall collected went to the University of Oklahoma, and then what became the Stovall Museum of Natural History and is now the Sam Noble Oklahoma Museum of Natural History. And in particular, the big Brontosaur and Saurophaganax form the centerpiece of the Mesozoic exhibit, The Clash of the Titans, which I think is just phenomenal, and I strongly recommend that everyone go see. And one of the coolest things is you can take the elevator up and look the big Brontosaur right in the eye from a very high second story, which is pretty cool. So we have Brontosaurus out there, and as Seth mentioned, sauropod dinosaurs are my specialty. This is probably a good time to talk about the dinosaur family tree. So dinosaurs basically split into two big groups. On one hand, there are the ornithischian dinosaurs, which include the horned and armored and duck-billed dinosaurs and their relatives. So from the Panhandle, we have Camtasaurus, which is an ornithopod, and we have Stegosaurus. The other big group is the Saurischian dinosaurs, which include the vulgar overstudied theropods, things like T-Rex and Deinonychus and Saurophaganax, and all 10,000 species of living birds, and Velociraptor, and way too many other overexposed, overly famous dinosaurs. And God's noblest creatures, the Sauropod dinosaurs, which started out as bipedal, dog-sized omnivores back in the Triassic, but they very quickly got their act together and turned into the giant four-legged, long-necked, long-tailed, iconic dinosaurs that we know and love. Now, you saw in the family tree, sauropods are not super far away from theropods, which include birds. And one thing that all or most of the members of that group, the Saurischian dinosaurs, share is air-filled bones. And people know this about birds. The birds have air-filled bones. It makes sense. It helps them helps probably improve their flight performance by lightening their skeletons. And it probably helps the giant dinosaurs grow big. And we can study that by taking their bones and looking at them with a CT scanner. And when we do, we see often similar honeycombs of internal chambers to what we see in birds. So this is actually a Black Mesa specimen. This was one of the first dinosaur bones that I got to CT scan when I was a graduate student. And it's been in many of my talks and papers because we got such great data out of it. Now, this is a neck vertebra from Brontosaurus. It's not a very prepossessing specimen. It should have lots of cool processes sticking off of it. All those bits are broken off. Either they got broken off in the field or over the years as the collection was moved around. But actually, that made the vertebra small enough to fit through a CT scanner. And that's a real concern for some of these sauropod bones is you have to double check that they're actually going to fit through a CT machine. And then if they're too big and too dense, medical machines sometimes struggle to blast x-rays all the way through them. We got really, really fortunate with that one. And you can see all these interesting little pockets and holes on the outside of the vertebra. These are all places where air was getting into the bone. And this may seem like a weird exotic system, but this is something you can investigate in your own kitchen with the vertebrae of a chicken or a turkey or a duck. Simmer them a little bit, scrape off all the goop. If you want nice white bones, soak them overnight in some ordinary drugstore hydrogen peroxide. And then honestly, the easiest way to see the internal structure is not to use a saw, but just sandpaper. Just 5 minutes with a piece of sandpaper, and you can see this fantastically complex honeycomb of internal air spaces, just like we see in giant dinosaurs. So this is probably one of the things that allowed dinosaurs to get big, and it's really handy for those of us who study sauropods because they had a lot of vertebrae. They had long necks and long tails. They tended to leave a lot of vertebrae in the rocks, and vertebrae turned out to be pretty useful for identifying sauropods because they're so complex. So one of the first things that I had to do when I was a graduate student, and this is a scan of some of my notebook pages from when I was first figuring this all out, is I had to figure out, how do I tell the vertebrae of Diplodocus from Apatosaurus, from Barosaurus, from Brachiosaurus? And it's precisely because the bone was interacting with these air sacs that was producing these complex arrays of bony struts and little pockets, that the bones are complex enough to be useful for identifying and classifying these dinosaurs. For most groups of animals, if you're trying to classify them, if you want to know who's who, if you're trying to identify them from a small bit, what you want is the most complex part, because that's probably the part that's evolving the fastest. And so for mammals, it's teeth. Mammal vertebrae are not that useful. The vertebrae of a cow do not look that different from the vertebrae of a giraffe unless you happen to get one from the neck. So you really want teeth. They'll get you down to the species level or even farther, generally in mammals. Teeth are useless for sauropods. Sauropods have basically two tooth shapes, the ones that look like pencils and the ones that look like spoons. But their vertebrae are fantastically weird and complex, not only outside, but also inside. And so that was what my early research consisted of, was taking bones from this fabulous collection at the museum in Norman up to the OU Health Science Center in Oklahoma City. And on Saturdays, when the CT scanner wasn't busy, I could CT scan dinosaur bones and look at the internal air spaces, which there had been very, very little of that work done in the late 90s when I was doing this. And then most of this got published between 2000 and 2003 by myself and my co-authors. And it's pretty cool. Camarosaurus is different from Brontosaurus, is different from other things. And I was using bones that had been collected by Stovall's crews out in the Panhandle. So that collection was my runway as a scientist to get up and running and launch my career. So literally my career was founded on Stovall specimens. And that illustrates the value of natural history collections. We dig these things up, we clean them up, we put them in museums, not so they can sit there doing nothing forever, so that they're a scientific resource for the future. When these guys were digging these things up, they didn't know that we were going to have CT machines. X-rays had barely been discovered. And certainly a lot of people would come along and look at a vertebra like this with all the processes broken off and saying, well, you know, does it even have any diagnostic characters left? Should we just junk the thing? But then you throw it through a CT machine and you have beautiful, beautiful findings. So we can't tell what use people are going to make of the fossil resources that we conserve right now. We gather them because we think that they are interesting, useful, and valuable, and part of our shared heritage, and we save them. And you can never tell what kinds of things people are going to figure out to do with them in the future. So we do have Camarosaurus out at Black Mesa. This is a dorsal vertebra, one from the middle of the back, OMNH for Oklahoma Museum of Natural History, specimen 1811. And it's got a couple of the processes on the sides broken off, but it's in pretty good shape. You can see that's the hole right there for the spinal cord. These are the air holes where air was getting into the bone. This is my favorite life restoration of Camarosaurus. This is by paleo artist Mark Hallett. And you'll see another version of that same painting a little later on in the talk in a different context. So we have Camarosaurus out there. We have Brachiosaurus. This is a life restoration by Brian Eng. We don't have a lot of Brachiosaurus. In fact, so far, the bones that we can confidently refer to Brachiosaurus are just this one bone, which is a bone from the hand. And you might be thinking, okay, wait a second, Wedel, you just said you need vertebrae because they're complex. How can you identify a whole dinosaur from one bone that looks like, I mean, this looks like a cartoon bone, right? It's straight, it's skinny in the middle, it's fat at both ends. This thing belongs on a pirate flag. How can we tell that's Brachiosaurus? It's because of the shape of sauropod hand bones. And basically, Brachiosaurus has long, slender hand bones. This is the same bone, it's a metacarpal, same bone as this one here in your own hand. I traced that one later in Photoshop to show the difference between my metacarpal and a metacarpal of Brachiosaurus. In Brachiosaurus, they're long and slender, and all of the other sauropods from the Morrison Formation, they're just kind of short and squat and dumpy looking. Sorry, Brontosaurus, I don't mean to dunk on your hand, but it's not nearly as graceful as the hand of Brachiosaurus. So we're pretty sure that that's a hand bone of Brachiosaurus from the Panhandle, and we really hope that more comes to light eventually, because that's a really exciting animal. But the most famous dinosaur from the Panhandle, obviously, is our big Apatosaurine, which for many, many years, and possibly still on the museum signage, is Apatosaurus. I think of the two, although I have not gotten my act together enough to say this in print, but I think of the two genera between Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus, the one we have in the Panhandle is more likely to be Brontosaurus. So this is probably the best big complete bone that we have. This is the same one that Stovall illustrated in that paper in 1938. And we can tell based on, it just has a little bit of a division there in the top of the spinous process, that it's probably the fifth dorsal vertebra, the fifth vertebra back from the base of the neck. And this thing is huge. It's 53 inches tall, so it's almost 4.5 feet tall. So lots of museums have mounted Apatosaurs or Brontosaurs. So Yale, the American Museum in New York, Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh, Field Museum in Chicago. Wyoming has a mounted Brontosaur skeleton, and that one actually is Brontosaurus. They're all roughly in the same size range, and that size range is a heck of a lot smaller than the one from the Panhandle. The one from the Panhandle is hands down the biggest by far. So, and it's not just based on this one bone. We have vertebrae from all different parts of the backbone. We have limb bones. We have parts of the shoulder girdle. And all of them say the same thing, that this animal was considerably larger than the big mounted skeletons in the museums back east and in Wyoming. So even though Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus differ in their detailed anatomy, you would have to squint pretty hard to tell them apart if they're standing next to each other. The one at the Carnegie Museum, the type specimen of Apatosaurus louisei, is the best preserved and the most complete. And so it's sort of become the reference specimen for Apatosaurus and Brontosaurus. And here you can see the split spines of the vertebrae sort of closing up as we go into the back. And so the fifth one back has a barely split spine. That's why we think that big Oklahoma vertebra is the fifth dorsal. So the Oklahoma giant was probably close to 100 feet long and probably had a mass somewhere in the 50, 60 ton range, which means it was not the biggest dinosaur of all time or the longest. There were longer things like Supersaurus that were probably 120 or 130 feet long, and there were definitely heavier things. Some of the big titanosaurs like Argentinosaurus probably topped 80 tons or more. But the Oklahoma Brontosaurus is in the conversation. It was a legitimately vast animal. And I don't want you to hold on to that thought, because that's going to come back and be relevant again later on in the talk. So there's Darcy Blows. There's our giant Oklahoma Apatosaur or Brontosaurus mounted with Saurophaganax in the museum in the Clash of the Titans exhibit. But as Seth mentioned, that's not all. There are also baby dinosaurs, and in particular baby sauropods from the Panhandle. And so here's a little tiny vertebra, and it's from a baby, so it was unfused. All the interesting bits fell off and either weren't preserved or at least weren't collected. And so now we just have sort of the body of the vertebra, but there are enough of these to reconstruct a good bit of the skeleton of a baby Brontosaur. And that's this little guy that's mounted in the Clash of the Titans exhibit. This one, based on how fast sauropods grew, this thing is about the size of a Labrador retriever with a longer neck and a longer tail. It's probably between 1 and 2 years old, based on what we think we know about how dinosaurs grew by counting the growth rings in their bones. So there was not a complete skeleton. So the bones that we have were cast. So we have quite a few of the limb bones and some of the shoulder girdle and hip bones and some of the bodies of the vertebrae. But a lot of missing bits had to be sculpted in here and sort of scaled, cross-scaled from bigger individuals. Things like the hands and the feet mostly had to be sculpted. And I'll talk later about how that happened. But it's pretty cool because we don't get baby sauropods very often. There's only a handful of Morrison quarries that have baby sauropods, and I think that's because most baby sauropods had two fates. Either they grew up into adult sauropods, in which case they couldn't leave baby skeletons behind, or they got turned into theropod poop by getting eaten by meat-eating dinosaurs. And that brings me, I think, to the bad guy here, Saurophaganax, which means lizard eater king. And this is an impressive animal. We have the femur, we have some of the girdle bones, the hand bones, a complete foot, I think, and some bits of the vertebrae. Not much, if anything, of the skull, but enough to tell that it was related to Allosaurus. It was very similar to Allosaurus, but it was closer in size to T-Rex. So a 40-footer or larger, probably 5 or 6 ton animal. And the hand claw, the thumb claw of Saurophaganax, is one of my favorite fossils in the world. So here's a cast of it with an ink pen for scale. So this groove had a blood vessel that would have nourished the sheath of keratin over the top. So this is just the bony core of the claw, and it would have been covered by fingernail material, which would have extended it by several inches. So it would have been a lot longer and more wickedly pointed. This is the bit back here that articulated with the next finger bone in line. And this bump is a muscle attachment scar. And this was for the big flexor muscles that would swing this claw. So there'd be a muscle attached here. The muscle would pull this way. The fulcrum or hinge was here, and the claw would go that way and hook into something. That's about the size of your heel bone. So imagine the amount of muscle that you have in your calf that you use for climbing stairs or doing squats or jumping. Imagine that volume of muscle pulling not on all the claws, but just on one claw on each hand, and then other muscles pulling on the other claws. It was a serious kit. The late Jurassic was probably not a super pleasant time to be around and be smaller than Saurophaganax. So far, all I've shown you are specimens that were collected by Stovall's crews. But I want to talk about Black Mesa today and the quarries out there and what's going on now. So I've been fortunate enough to work out there, not quite every year. Obviously, we missed a little time because of the pandemic, but from 2016 onward, I've been out there almost every year, and it's beautiful. And I know this will be old hat for the folks in the No Man's Land Historical Society, but for people who may catch this later, if you haven't been there, if you haven't heard about Black Mesa, the reason it's called Black Mesa is it's capped with a layer of lava, basalt, from a big volcanic province that extends over into New Mexico. And so that lava flowed during the age of mammals. The dinosaur bearing layers are down on the slopes of the mesa. And as you're driving out there, you can tell you're in dinosaur country. When you're going through Boise City, there's signs for dinosaurs. The Cimarron Heritage Center is out there, and they've got an awesome big metal brontosaur on the edge of town that you can see from a long ways off, which is a favorite roadside attraction of mine. And as you're driving out towards the town of Clinton and towards the mesa itself, as you start getting into country that looks like western Colorado, buttes and mesas and cliffs and sandstone, you go past Quarry 1, Pit 1, which is where they found the rib, the first discovery of dinosaurs in the Oklahoma Panhandle. And the quarry's still there. It's right off the side of the road. It hasn't produced anything in a long time. And every time that I go, I walk around with my eyes on the ground, and I hope that I'll find something. So far, nothing. But there's a cast of a brontosaur femur in concrete to mark the spot to commemorate the discovery that was put in place by folks from the Sam Noble Museum. And in the town of Kenton, there's a little museum that has a fantastic amount of local history, natural history, prehistory, and also the human history of the settlement of that part of the country, which is not so far back in the memory of some of the oldest Kenton residents. And to me, Black Mesa is just a gorgeous place. I feel really fortunate to get to go there. It has so much to offer in terms of scenery, wildlife. I've seen amazing things out there, like this double rainbow that I caught a couple years ago. Or the very first time that I went, a herd of bighorn sheep jumped a fence and ran across the road right in front of the pickup. That was a thrill, and probably something that I'm not going to have repeated anytime soon, but I'm really glad that I was able to hop out and shoot in burst mode and catch these critters. And when we go out there, we find evidence of the world that used to be, not the one that's there now. So things like this ripple rock that was laid down at the edge of either a lake or a slow-moving river that points to a much wetter and lusher environment than what's there now. There's petrified wood from trees, and big trees don't tend to grow as isolated individuals out on the floodplain. We're not talking about acacia-sized things here, like you'd see on the Serengeti. We're talking about redwood-sized things here. Those trees only grow in forests. So we know that at least part of the time there were big forests out there that were probably feeding the big dinosaurs. There are dinosaur tracks. This is my son, London. He's a little older now and has a different haircut, but these are some tracks of probably a mid-sized plant-eating dinosaur, probably Camtasaurus. And these tracks look best after a rain and at sunset, I discovered by sheer chance. If you visit Stovall's quarries, there's still traces of dinosaurs there. So this is a quarry 5. That's a theropod tooth, a meat-eating dinosaur tooth that is slowly crumbling out of the rock. It's far from complete. It's basically a hollow shell of tooth material now, not worth collecting, but nice to point out to visitors and reinforce the fact that there are dinosaurs in them Nar Hills. And at some of the quarries, you can walk around and find stuff on the ground. Things are still weathering out. So when I took my son out there when he was a lot younger than he is now, in the first 10 minutes, he found a fossil before I did. He found a croc tooth. Then I found a croc tooth. We found some bits of armor from crocs and turtles and from miscellaneous bone. All of this stuff is in the Sam Noble Museum now. So these are collections that, who knows, someday in the future, someone may figure out stuff to do with croc teeth, like I got lucky enough to figure out to do with sauropod vertebrae. I don't know what use they'll make of these things, but I imagine that they'll be useful at some point. So they're conserved. Here we are reopening one of Stovall's old quarries. This is quarry 8. And as soon as we got, 80 plus years of accumulated dirt and boulders and shrubs and stuff off and got down to the fresh rock face that they had been working on in the 1930s and 40s, we started finding bone. And one of the last missives from that early pulse of collecting is from December 1941. From the end of that month, the attack on Pearl Harbor had already happened. Everybody knew that we were heading into war. That's where the money and the material was going to go for the next few years. And so things kind of got closed down out there. And it's really thrilling to get to go back and be part of that story of reopening those quarries and finding new fossils. But most of the fossils that have come out of the Panhandle in the past 10 years have come from this hole in the ground. This is Homestead Quarry, and it's been managed for the past decade by Ann Weil, basically since it was discovered. She has my job at OSU Tulsa. She's an anatomist and paleontologist, and her specialty is early mammals, and she's in quest of the first Jurassic mammal from Oklahoma, and I'm certain that she's going to get it. But along the way, she's finding lots of big dinosaurs, and so it's been a fruitful collaboration for me, because she invites me to come out and help dig up dinosaurs, and then we study them together. So that's a pretty good gig. And we do have a lot of fun in the quarry because it is really cool. This part of paleontology hasn't changed a lot since the 1930s. We're using everything from pickaxes and sledgehammers to break some of the overlying boulders, down to rock hammers and awls and chisels to work around the bones and then put plaster jackets on them. We get nice and sticky and goopy and get plaster all over ourselves and our faces. And that's just part of the gig, as I'm sure it was in the 1930s. Then what do we do? What is the actual job? So the dinosaur bones get encased in plaster. They get taken back either to the Sam Noble Museum or to Ann's lab at OSU Tulsa, and they get prepared And that means sometimes you have a three-dimensional jigsaw puzzle. You can see some pieces right there that are not much bigger than postage stamps that are put together out of a box of bits with glue. And one of the best tools for a paleontologist or preparator in that situation is a sandbox, because you can put the pieces in the sandbox. You can see how they fit together. You can do some test fits and put some glue on them. And this is a tail vertebra of Brontosaurus. This is from the Homestead Quarry. This is one of Ann's specimens. And it's cool because, look, there are holes. There are pockets in this thing that were made by air sacs, both on the body of the vertebra and up here on the spine. And what's really exciting about the Homestead Quarry is that they're tail vertebrae of Brontosaurus mostly. So far, it's not only tail vertebrae, but it's all Brontosaurus as far as we can tell. And they're big. They're not as big as the largest Stovall specimens, but they're still bigger than the ones at the Carnegie and Yale and Chicago and all those other places. And that's really exciting that it seems like there were just giant Brontosaurs out there for a while. That's what was making up the fauna out there in the Morrison forests of Oklahoma 145 million years ago. And not all of the specimens are so prepossessing. This one took us a while to puzzle over. It turns out to be a smashed neck vertebra. You would be forgiven for thinking that it looks like a piece of crap, but it's not. First of all, because it's a sauropod bone, and sauropod bones are never pieces of crap. They're shards of excellence. But sometimes we get these shards of excellence, and their excellence takes a little bit of unraveling. So Ann and I work together on identifying these things. And this, we have, then when we go to Norman, to the Sam Noble Museum, we have this amazing collection of fossils. These are vertebrae of dinosaurs from Black Mesa and the surrounding area that Stovall's teams got way back in the 1930s and 40s, and they're now our comparative collection for helping to interpret the fossils that Ann and her crews are finding at the Homestead Quarry. And it's not just big stuff too, it's little stuff like this croc tooth. I mentioned that Ann, although she's in the Army now as a dinosaur researcher, her longtime specialty is early mammals. And so she brings approaches to a dinosaur quarry that are pretty cool, like screen washing. So promising looking dirt and rock from the quarry, clay stuff with interesting looking bits in it, goes into these plastic tubs with screen material on the bottom in a stock tank with some Dixie cups. And you wash away the clay and get what's left. And these are little tiny things. They look like seeds. They're about 1/8 of an inch long, maybe. And these are the shells of little tiny ostracods. Ostracods are shrimp with shells. They're still alive today. And they were around in the Morrison times. They were living in the water that was washing over the brontosaur bones and burying them. And so they're telling us something about the environment. These things are great because they evolve quickly and they have lots of species. And so they can help us tell where exactly we are in time if we don't have something like an ash layer to date, which we don't. So it turns out Ann's crews are collecting everything from little tiny shrimp, the size of a pencil lead basically, all the way up to tail vertebrae from giant brontosaurs. And the reason that she's collecting all this stuff is because we don't want to know just about brontosaurs. We want to know about the world of the Morrison of Oklahoma. We want to know, why do we have gigantic brontosaurs and gigantic allosaurids in the form of saurophaganax out there and not at other places? Why don't the brontosaurs get that big anywhere else? Why aren't there T-Rex size allosaurs other places? There's one scrappy one from Colorado. But most places allosaurs don't get that big, but they got that big in Oklahoma. Was it because they were trying to take down giant brontosaurs? There's a million questions that we have about these ecosystems, about these worlds. And so in that sense, this talk is very much just a progress report on research that is still underway and will probably be underway for a long time. And with that, I'm kind of winding down, but I want to encourage everyone. These fossils from Black Mesa and from the Panhandle are part of the heritage of Oklahoma and of the United States. And they're part of our shared heritage. And I want people to see them. I want people to get excited about them and to understand that this is part of the world that we have temporary stewardship of. So this is not a Jurassic dinosaur. This is a Cretaceous dinosaur. This is Sauroposeidon. At Christmas time, it gets a hat, and it's Santa Poseidon. So this is at the Sam Noble Museum too. So I want people to go to the museum. I want them to see these fossils and engage with this part of our shared history, and make a connection to unimaginably giant animals, unimaginably vast time scales. This is inspiring stuff. I feel extremely blessed to get to work on this stuff and to have so many excellent friends and colleagues. If you'd like to know more, I run a very geeky blog with a colleague from England called Sauropod Vertebra Picture of the Week, or SVPOW. And we tend to make our papers freely available there. I told you you'd see Mark Hallett's Camarosaurus painting again. It's on the cover of my book that I wrote with him, The Sauropod Dinosaurs, Life in the Age of Giants. So if you are dying to know more about sauropods, that's the way to go. If you're interested in the Morrison, my friend John Foster has a new edition of his book, Jurassic West, and he talks about the Oklahoma Morrison because he talks about the entire Morrison. It's what he did his dissertation on. And it's a fantastically comprehensive, but also extremely readable and well illustrated book, and I highly recommend it. You've seen some of Brian Eng's art in this talk. He's got a website, don'tmesswithdinosaurs.com. He's got a paleo art channel on YouTube. In particular, if you're interested in this stuff, go check out Jurassic Reimagined, which is a video that he and I worked on together. I wrote a little bit, he wrote a lot and shot a lot and did a lot of music and art. And there will be more. This is just part one. There'll be more Jurassic Reimagined videos coming as we get them done, because we're on a quest to understand the Morrison. I want to thank some folks. My mentor, Rich Cifelli, took me under his wing way back when I was in high school, when I started volunteering at the museum, and guided me through my undergraduate research and my master's research. And he introduced me to Black Mesa. He took me out there for the first time in 2016. Here he is at Stovall's Quarry 5, looking for bits and bobs on the ground. I want to thank Kyle Davies. He is retired now, but he was a head preparator at the Sam Noble Museum for a long time. And he helped me a lot in my research in this way, which is that if you needed something made, Kyle would just make it. Like I said that a lot of the bones from this baby sauropod didn't exist and had to be sculpted. The person who sculpted them is Kyle. And so in particular, there's a little complex bit of a couple of vertebrae here right behind the skull. We didn't have those fossils. Kyle just sculpted them. And he made this kind of very primary colored, almost kindergarten version for the teaching collection. But that's his sculpture there right behind the baby Brontosaurus head. So when I needed specimens to have, a supporting jacket so I could study them in a particular way, I'd ask Kyle about it and he'd whip that stuff up. So he has been a huge help to me. And he has come out to dig at Black Mesa for years and years. But my biggest thanks are to Ann Weil, because she has been a great friend and mentor and has taught me a lot about the diversity of techniques that you need if you're trying to capture everything from shrimp to sauropods in a quarry and you're trying to understand an entire vanished ecosystem. So to Anne and her crews, to all the people who've come out and dig every year, they're carrying this story forward. And in another 90 years, somebody's going to be giving a talk about Black Mesa, and her name and Stovall's will be mentioned in the same breath. So thanks to all these folks and more, the Whit Newman Foundation for funding most of the research out there, Dean Richmond for teaching me a lot about Black Mesa geology, and for all the folks that have pitched in and make that such an active and engaging place to work. And thank you all for your time and attention.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matt. My dad and I independently discovered that tooth that you're showing as well. We found it back in the fall, about down in the bottom of that crevasse splay. Is that quarry 5 or is that quarry 6? I get confused. I have such a hard time keeping all that straight.
That's quarry 5.
Okay. All right. That's always what I thought. Okay. Then what's the big one like? And we're in question time, I guess. Now, what's the big
That's
one?
fine.
You know where the tracks down in Carrizo Creek are, right? Okay. And then if you go off to the road to the south.
I think that's 6. I know what you're talking about. There's like a low bluff that's like maybe a yard tall and like maybe 30 yards long.
Okay, I
sure
haven't turned around then. Okay.
Yeah,
But
quarry
yeah, I always have. Go
Quarry
ahead.
5's up. Quarry 5's up on the side of the hill. It's the one that has the cliff face that I think they stopped working because there's some thick limestone up there, and eventually the cliff face was like 20 feet tall, and I just don't think it was safe to keep going.
Okay. All right. Yeah, no,
But
that's
there's still fossils out there because I see that one of the people in the meeting is Jeff Hargrave from the Whit Newman Foundation. So he's out there with us a lot. We were at Quarry 5 in the fall of 2020, I think. And he was just poking around in one of the tailings piles and he pulled up a piece of dinosaur bone about yay big. And it was a chunk of the spinous process from a vertebra of Apatosaurus. So one, that was in a tailings pile. It means that Stovall's guys probably tossed it. Scientific priorities have changed. Now we want everything, even the scraps, because we don't know what people might make use of it in the future. They were looking for nice big specimens because they wanted a big mounted skeleton for the museum. And so I suspect that it was broken and they tossed it because it was incomplete, but it has enough anatomical characters that I could take it and be like, yep, that's Apatosaur, an Apatosaurian, probably Brontosaurus. So that specimen that Jeff picked up is in the Sam Noble Museum in the collections now. And I think it's cool that we can go back to these quarries after all this time and still find things. And some of the quarries stopped being worked because they got mined out. There's just nothing more to find. But some of them work shut down for other reasons. At Quarry 5, it was because it wasn't safe anymore. At Quarry 8, it was because a world war had started. So I think there's a lot of scientific potential out there. And in particular with modern techniques, modern collecting techniques, modern approaches, the number of kinds of things that we can learn is just vast. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and taphonomy and so on as well, which Dean, by the way, has done a recent paper on the taphonomy and so on. I know. Actually, I meant to bring this to his attention, and I totally forgot. Dean and I have been in contact a little bit as well. Dean Richmond and I.
Yeah, he'd be great to give a talk.
Yeah, have been in contact a little bit as well. Yeah, like you're saying, things like taphonomy, or another thing that people weren't even thinking about. Taphonomy, for those of you guys who don't know, taphonomy is sort of the study of the process of fossilization in paleontology, if you want to think about it. I think about it, and Matt can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think about it in terms of taphonomists are worried about everything that happens between the time an animal dies and even how an animal dies, basically up until the point that it is collected in the field. And that's what taphonomists study. They want to figure out everything that happened from how the animal died up until all of the processes until it was collected. And that's what they're doing. And, that involves data about ecology, and it involves looking at the sediments surrounding the bone and all kinds of things like that, but to figure out what happened. But, yeah, like Matt's saying, that stuff wasn't even on the radar when Stovall was collecting. It wasn't really until Kay Berensmeyer and people like that came around and started really taking that aspect of paleontology seriously. That, what was that, probably 70s, 80s?
That's when it really took off. Yeah, there had been some work mostly in Germany as early as the 20s, but I don't think that it really took off in the English-speaking paleontology world until the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, with Kay Berensmeyer, whom I've met as well before. She's a good lovely woman. But yeah, that kind of stuff. So there's questions that we hadn't even thought of asking when Stovall was doing all of his stuff out there in the 30s, you know. So yeah.
Matt, do you have any idea of what the lifespan of the Brontosaurus was? Did you get that?
Sorry, can you repeat that?
Yeah. Do you have any idea of what the lifespan of a Brontosaurus was?
I suspect it might have been quite long. We know that sauropods grew pretty quickly. They weren't growing well when they were first hatched. Some of them were probably growing as fast as birds. At least some of the titanosaurs were. I've actually got. Stay tuned. There may be some interesting information about that out in the not too distant future. But we know that that the biggest ones were taking several decades to mature. There's a really big Mamenchisaur from Mongolia or China that I think took 3 decades to reach full size. And that was probably an animal comparable in size to the big Oklahoma Brontosaur. There's a Camarosaurus from Wyoming that took 38 years to mature. But one of the things that fascinates me is potential longevity, because big animals tend to live a long time. And we know now that some whales can live to be 150, 200 years old. Part of the problem is with studying really long-lived animals is that some of these long-lived animals are older than science. Like there's Greenland sleeper sharks that are probably 300 or 400 years old. Really? Some of those individuals that are alive right now are probably predate us having a classification for them at all. So if things like, even elephants can live to be into their 70s, 60s or 70s, and they don't die of old age, they die because they run out of teeth. Whales can live to be well over a century, maybe 2 centuries. We don't actually know how old whales can get. And we probably never will, at least for a long time, because most of the biggest and oldest ones probably got hunted for whale oil. So it's a tantalizing possibility that some of the biggest sauropods could have lived for centuries. And I think has really interesting implications for thinking about their ecology and evolution. If they start reproducing as subadults, which they did, most sauropods look like they probably started reproducing when they were about 1/3 grown. So potentially you can have a population that trundles along with basically running on teenage pregnancy and maybe doesn't produce adults at all for a long time until conditions are right for one to grow all the way up into one of these 70-ton monsters. But then maybe that 70-ton monster is effectively predator immune, and they can just sort of spam the environment with hundreds of eggs every year for a century. Nothing in the development of ecological science has prepared us really to even think about what it's like to have a whale-sized animal on land that makes hundreds of eggs every year for a century or maybe several centuries. Like, we don't really even have the tools to think about that very well, I feel like. So that's one of the things that is most interesting to me about dinosaurs is they were very, very much not us. They weren't mammals. They didn't do things the way that mammals do. You've got an animal with a skeleton like a bird that's the size of a whale that reproduces like a sea turtle. That's a lot of conflicting models, and none of those models may be exactly perfect. So it's exciting for me to throw myself up against questions like that. Is a very, very long-winded way of answering your question. Probably they lived a long time.
Yeah, thanks.
So, okay. So how does an animal, how many calories a day does this animal need? That's starting to...
So there was a study that was done back in the 80s. It was published in Paleobiology that was looking at caloric requirements. And they made some dodgy assumptions. For one thing, they assumed that a Brachiosaurus could only eat about as much as a giraffe because their heads are about the same size, is what's stated in the paper. That's wildly inaccurate. The head of a Brachiosaurus is so big you could fit a giraffe head through its mouth. The other thing is you look at mammal heads and we have big cheek teeth and big cheeks because we chew, but the actual bite area is not very big. Sauropods were like Pac-Man. Like it's all mouth because they didn't chew. They just had to bite and swallow. Another thing we've learned since the 80s is that some things that we thought weren't very nutritious because they're not very nutritious for mammals or because mammals avoid them for other reasons can actually be very nutritious. So things like horsetails are easy to digest and have tons of protein. And if you're a fast-growing dinosaur, horsetails are fantastic. And we know this because that's what fast-growing dinosaurs eat today. So when geese fly up to the Arctic and nest and the babies have to get up and running, hatch, fledge, and go on a 1,000-mile migration in just a few months, what do they eat? Almost pure horsetails. The reason mammals don't eat horsetails is because they're full of silica. Basically, they grow little sharp spiky bits of sand in their cell walls that'll wear your teeth away completely if you are a mammal and try to eat horsetails. But if you're a bird or a sauropod, birds don't have teeth. Sauropods were shedding theirs all the time. Go ahead and eat the horsetails, grow fast. So then we're sneaking up on the question of how could the landscape support such a diversity of giant animals? And I think that although there's definitely evidence for some dry times in the Morrison, and that may be mega droughts that were killing critters, that may be when a lot of our fossil record is from, there were definitely lush times, like overlying Homestead Quarry is limestone that was probably laid down in a big lake. And there were crocs and turtles and ostracods in the water that buried these brontosaur bones. So I think that a lot of the time, these environments were really productive, like possibly rainforest level productive. There are big trees from up in Utah that have no growth rings because they didn't stop growing at all. Like for the lifespan of that tree, the temperatures and the moisture requirements were so equitable that they could just grow full time forever. And that's an aspect of that research, which is published by Carol Gee in the past couple of years. That's an aspect of, or a potential aspect of Morrison ecology that hasn't really gotten discussed very much. Like the fact that there were probably salt lakes and occasionally big droughts and stuff like that, that's gotten discussed a lot. The other side of it, what happens when the Morrison is wet, maybe for decades or centuries, I think is much less explored.
Well, I mean, even the paleoclimatology of it itself sounds interesting. How, what would, what kind of atmospheric conditions would come together and ocean's circulation patterns to cause the mega droughts and stuff like that is interesting. I know you go back earlier to the Triassic, there is the idea of the Carnian pluvial event, the idea of, extremely wet periods in the Earth's history and mega monsoons and things like that as well. That is interesting. And since I see Shelley, who gave our last talk on some of the Dust Bowl stuff, I wanted to switch gears real quick and ask kind of a question real quick, because I want to know, all the field notes are lost, right? All the field stuff from Stovall is lost. Is that right?
That is a good question that I'm not well equipped to answer. I know that some of it is lost, but I don't think that all of it is lost. I know that there's been an effort at the museum to recover like the field maps that were made back then. I think the answer is that a lot was lost, but the loss wasn't total.
Yeah. Okay. So I was just wondering if there was any, since it's an historical site, if there's any notes that were left, if they got hit by dust storms during the Dust Bowl or anything like that. Was just a total, almost idle question that I had, but I was curious if there's anything like that in the notes.
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's so here you're going to see my limitation as a scholar, and you're also seeing my kitchen because I thought that I would have help pulling dinner out of the oven, and I'm going to yank it before it burns. But as an anatomist, I have been pretty narrowly focused on figuring out these critters' bodies and putting them back together. And I just know much less about those historical aspects. It's not that they're not interesting, they are. Just, you can't study everything as much as you might like to.
Yeah, no, I
There
understand
is
that.
a
Yeah.
correspondence at the museum that is preserved. And it is incredibly boring if you're not a paleontologist. It's a lot of queries back and forth about supplies, materials. They were almost always out of toilet paper.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of the, the technical nitty gritty about managing a field camp that has been preserved.
Well, and I've been interested in that, just the WPA collections that were made during the 30s in general. I've just thought, broadly, I've been interested in that particular topic with of course, what came from Black Mesa being one aspect of that. But I was just, and like I said, I was just curious if, that seemed like something that maybe they might have made a note of. I don't know if any dust storms hit them while they were doing that, because they'd have been in the middle of the Dust Bowl, at that time and place. So there's just something I was curious about.
I was thinking about that too, in a slightly different way. Of all of the interviews that I have done with people from Cimarron, Texas, Beaver County with the Dust Bowl, and all of the things that I have read, I have never heard anyone's talk about or read a firsthand account of people who were on a WPA crew extracting dinosaur bones. And I just think that sounds so fascinating. And now I'm on the hunt and prowl watching for that. And it has piqued my interest in the work that I do.
By the way,
We were
Matt,
hit by
Shelley-
a storm
yeah.
at the Homestead Quarry at one point, and it was small on the scale of dust storms.
Mhm.
But we got inside as fast as we could. We're lucky, thanks to the Whitney Newman Foundation, to be able to get inside pretty nearby. And everybody had their bandanas over their faces before we got back to the house, because nobody wanted to breathe that. But you really couldn't see, to the other side of the Cimarron River Valley there.
Yeah. Yeah, no, like I said, it's just a question I've been curious about. And like I said, I've been curious about that, those WPA fossil excavations just in themselves, I thought that's a really interesting aspect, just the history of the WPA and the history of science, the history of paleontology and so on as well. And I just, something I've been, curious about, wanted to learn more about, and maybe even try to do a project with myself or something if I could ever get the gumption, So, but anyway.
Juan Langston wrote a history of the museum that includes a pretty sizable chunk about what the work was like out there. And that's where I got virtually everything that I know about it. And like the problems with finding good people and keeping them on, and turnover, getting people trained, having shortages of supplies, miserable conditions sometimes. We have the freedom now to go to the field when it's convenient. They were working when they could, and when circumstances allowed, not necessarily when it would be the ideal time of the year to go. So I have a lot of respect for those people. They were hardcore. They put the time in.
Yeah, well, there's some places in Wyoming, at Como Bluff, I've read about too, where they worked through the winter, and of course those places are called like freeze out hills and so on, and they had thermometers with them below zero the whole time that they were excavating those fossils in like the 1870s, 1880s up there in Wyoming. So it's just, it's gotta be pretty tough to do that kind of stuff.
Yeah. I thought we were roughing it in Utah a few years ago when we were getting a Brachiosaur humerus out and it was freezing overnight. We're waking up with ice in our water bottles. Because when it's dry and cold, plasters can set up really fast. Basically, the plaster was setting up on that thing as fast as we could make it. And normally you set a batch of plaster and you wait until it hardens up and then you do another batch. We were just doing one batch after another until the job was done. Basically, we didn't get a break because it was setting up so fast. So I don't know what you do when it's that cold.
Yeah. Does anyone else have any questions? Do we need to let you go eat dinner, Matt?
My son will be home in about 15 minutes, but I'm happy if people have questions, I'm happy to yap.
Okay.
The opportunities that I get to have people just ask me questions about dinosaurs,
Yeah.
I'm usually not going to be the one who's going to shut that conversation down.
Fair enough.
But if you all have things to get onto, it's been really lovely, and thank you again for having me. Thank you for your time and attention. If you have questions.
Really enjoyed it.
Yeah, Matt, thank you very much. There was one more thing I thought that I was actually now, and then I just lost it. I had actually thought, oh yeah, no, I wanted you to, okay, I did want you to talk a little bit specifically, again, if you have time, to talk a little bit, tell us everything that you know about the baby sauropods. That was something that I was really interested in.
So
what we know about them right now.
I've seen that material. I've photographed almost all of it and measured almost all of it. There's definitely more than one individual, and they're definitely not all the same age. So the one that's mounted in the museum is the smallest, but there's one that's maybe about twice that size, from which we have fewer bones, which is interesting because that means we're now probably looking at not only adults, but also juveniles spread over maybe 2 or 3 or 4 years. And we just don't find the adults and the babies together that often. When we have like big sauropod mega track sites, the smallest individuals in the herd are usually about 1/3 the size of the biggest. And it's very rare, extremely rare. I know of only 1 or 2 cases in the world where there are little tiny baby sauropod tracks with the adult sauropod tracks. And that may just be because we know sauropods, we're pretty sure sauropods weren't taking care of their babies. They're burying the eggs and leaving them sea turtle style. Virtually all other dinosaurs, including sauropod ancestors, were practicing parental care, and sauropods stopped doing that. So the babies aren't living with the adults. The adults aren't providing any parental care, and usually it seems like they're probably in different environments because we just don't find baby sauropods that often where we find the adult sauropods. We don't find baby sauropods that often at all. So that's another way in which, and that's something I don't think I haven't mentioned in the talk, is that Anne's not only got the tail vertebrae from the big Brontosaur, which is, I forget what the numbers are. It's in the order of like 10 or 15% bigger than the big ones back east, whereas Stovall's monster is like 30% bigger. But she's also got some elements of small, juvenile, if not babies on the size of the little one, certainly very young sauropods. Things were probably just a handful of years old. So that's also cool because maybe this is a special environment, maybe one that persisted over time, where you had adult and baby sauropods coexisting, and not just babies, but juveniles, like things that were 1 to a few years old. That virtually never happens. So I'm really excited. It's one of the reasons I get excited to go to Homestead every year and visit Anne at her lab in Tulsa. Is I want to hear about the new stuff. Like, give me the deets.
Yeah.
What are we going to find out about these cool critters and the environment that they live in?
Well, yeah, I mean, as I recall from Dean's paper that I read as well, that he's hypothesizing anyway that these are all put together by a drought, right? That's how the animals, and that's what caused the deaths of the animals, right? Probably, right?
Yeah, I think that's at least for a lot of the Stovall material, yes. Homestead, I'm less sure about, and I would defer to Anne on that.
Yeah. So then my question, I guess my thought, maybe more than my question on that then too, is though maybe it could just be that it's a unique circumstance. It's concentrating adults and juveniles and all of that together. You know, I don't know if, you know, extrapolating maybe to broader patterns from that I don't know, that seems like maybe it's just a unique circumstance, maybe, that's bringing them all together.
Concentrated at a water hole or something.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, all concentrated at the water hole or something, because they're just in this unique mega drought situation, like you said, where then it's bringing them all together. Anyway, it's
Yeah,
like
I think that's plausible, but I know just about enough taphonomy to get in trouble, but not enough to get myself back out.
yeah,
So
yeah, fair enough. Does anyone else have comments, questions? I don't mean to take over the conversation. Okay. Well, and Matt, you probably, like I said, you probably need to go eat dinner. But
well,
yeah.
Thanks very much, folks. It was a lot of fun. And I will check out your YouTube channel and future talks. And
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There was a comment in the chat, by the way. Someone was asking. Yeah, I usually have the YouTube of this will go live probably at noon on Tuesday. That's usually when I set it to go live to premiere at is at noon on Tuesday. So there was someone in the chat asking if when this is going to be up, and it'll be up on our YouTube page at noon on Tuesday, most likely is when I'll have it premiere.
cool.
So
I'll look forward to a link and I'll promote it on SVPal.
all right, sounds good. Sounds good. Thank you so much, Matt. We appreciate it so much.
Thanks, everyone. It was a lot of fun.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Take care.
Interesting, thanks.
You live in California.
Yeah. Thanks for coming by, Shelley.
Yeah, I know, this is great fun. Thanks for
Welcome back. Yeah, no, like I said, I was interested too, because I've been interested just in the history of that WPA stuff and so on as well, huh?
Yeah.
Oh,
I
yeah.
know. I think it's great.
Yeah. And I thought, well, it'd be, I don't know, I'd like to pursue that project, and I don't know if, but I need almost a historian's input too, to some extent, how to go about doing it, I don't know.
You need something to get you started for sure.
Yeah, I need a way to get started on it, to actually get kicked in gear. I even have a title running around in my head that's like, Dinosaurs and Dust Bowls or something like that,
Yeah.
title like that running around in my head.
Well, like I said, my interest is peaked. So if I run across something, I'll send it your way.
Yeah, absolutely.
Dust storms were
Oh, Thank you,
actually,
Scott.
What were you gonna say, Sue?
dust storms were actually recorded even in the memory,
Mhm.
even in the 1800s, late 1800s,
Yeah.
here anyway.
Yeah. Well, yeah, there's, like, I was reading a history of Kansas